You could see elements of John Diefenbaker in this last election campaign on all parties, talking about who they represent. Every party was talking about an independent Canada. Every party was talking about helping ordinary Canadians. So those lessons endure across political lines. I think he's got lessons for all politicians.
John Diefenbaker was a political maverick, a prairie populist who rose from humble beginnings to become Canada's 13th Prime Minister. He was a complex and at times polarizing figure who throughout his 39 years as a Member of Parliament remained a political outsider, even within the Conservative Party he led. Diefenbaker's strong personality alienated some of his fellow MPs in the Tory caucus, who regarded him as a lone wolf, brusque, domineering, and untrusting. But Dief the Chief's charisma captivated ordinary Canadians who were inspired by his commitment to their health and welfare, his oratorical flair, and his common touch. They saw John Diefenbaker as a man of the people. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. John George Diefenbaker was born in 1895 in Neustadt, Ontario, in the southwestern region of the province. He was the grandson of German and Scottish immigrants. When he was 8 years old, he and his family moved west, where he grew up poor in the fledgling province of Saskatchewan. John Diefenbaker served as a lieutenant in the First World War. After graduating from the University of Saskatchewan in 1919, he became a small-town lawyer who reveled in fighting for the marginalized, downtrodden, and dispossessed. He was a self-described sworn enemy of discrimination and injustice. As a young man, Diefenbaker brimmed with political ambition. It took him some years to find his footing, but once he finally won an election, he never lost his riding again. In the mid-1950s, Diefenbaker took over a fractious and deflated Conservative Party, refashioned it in his image, and transformed it into a political juggernaut, winning 3 consecutive federal elections, one of them in an historic landslide. John Diefenbaker provoked strong emotions. His critics accused him of being an erratic, reckless, and ill-disciplined leader. They blamed him for what they regarded as a series of foreign policy blunders, including mishandling Canada's critical relationship with the United States. They attacked him for cancelling a Canadian aviation marvel, the Avro Arrow. His supporters, though, hailed him as a principled visionary, praising him for giving Indigenous peoples the vote, championing the Bill of Rights, a precursor to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, instituting a more inclusive immigration policy, and boldly opposing South Africa's readmission to the Commonwealth due to its failure to renounce its white supremacist system of racial apartheid. John Diefenbaker was a man of contradictions. He could be petty, vindictive, unforgiving, and even cruel, but also warm, witty, generous, and magnanimous. At this fraught moment in which Canada is facing existential threats to its economy and political sovereignty from the sitting President of the United States, Donald Trump, John Diefenbaker provides an historical example of an idealistic, impassioned political leader who was a fierce, unrepentant Canadian nationalist and refused to capitulate or bend the knee to American hegemony. Bob Plamondon is an acclaimed writer and Canadian historian who thinks for too long John Diefenbaker has been unfairly maligned by his critics and hasn't been given his due. He's the author of 6 books, including Blue Thunder, The Truth About Conservatives from Macdonald to Harper, and The Shawinigan Fox, How Jean Chretien Defeated the Elites and Reshaped Canada. His latest book is called Freedom Fighter, John Diefenbaker's Battle for Canadian Liberties and Independence. Bob Plamondon, welcome to In Bed with the Elephant.
Great to be with you, Adrian.
Bob, first of all, thanks so much for this book.
Well, it's my privilege and my pleasure and my honor to write about Canada, an improbable country that's managed to succeed where others thought that we would fail. And it's because of the great leadership that we've had over our time, all the way through, that has allowed us to survive and thrive as an independent country.
Well, Bob, John Diefenbaker was the Prime Minister of Canada over 60 years ago, and there have been numerous assessments of John Diefenbaker as a Prime Minister, as a political figure, and many of them have been unfavorable. He's often been rated as a second-rate prime minister. He's been depicted as a buffoon, a cartoonish character, as a blowhard. Why a book about John Diefenbaker now?
For the reasons that you mentioned, that there's a certain impression of John Diefenbaker that I think does not correspond with the reality. So there is in part correcting some of the myths about him, that in almost every instance he was on the right side of history. The passage of time has proven that to be correct. And so we needed an evidence-based, objective look at his record and his legacy. But the real value of looking back at Diefenbaker and looking back, I think, at any political leader is, what does it teach us about the issues, the challenges, and the problems that we face as a nation today? There's, nothing that we face today hasn't been in some respect faced before. And so what lessons can we draw, for example, from a prime minister who took great pains to stand up to an American president to assert Canadian sovereignty? So there's lessons to be learned and much to be inspired. And when we whether it's English-French relations, Canadian-American relations, relations with Indigenous people, there's a lot that we can draw from on John Diefenbaker, so we better understand Canada and its place in the world and its future.
And yet some pretty esteemed historians, journalists have written some not too nice things about him. Andrew Cohen, the former Carleton University professor, my former colleague, said that historians find him a failed prime minister, a blowhard, fantasist, and paranoiac. Jack Granatstein observed that Diefenbaker was, quote, venomous, self-serving, and notoriously unreliable. You say that Diefenbaker is underrated and should be regarded as one of Canada's greatest prime ministers. What do the critics get so wrong?
Well, of course, those quotes you mentioned, those and many others like them are in my book. I wanted to lay that down as a foundation for what people were saying about John Diefenbaker. I think a lot of those criticisms of Diefenbaker, some misinformed, some of them partisan, some of them, are people selling books. And so, they have a particular perspective to take. But fundamentally, John Diefenbaker grew up in poverty. He did not have an elite education. He wanted nothing to do with the powerful or the wealthy. So he had this outsider mentality. He saw his connection most important with ordinary Canadians. And if he was attached to anyone more so than ordinary Canadians, that those who were struggling, the poor, those who had been discriminated against. And so when you compare him with, Lester Pearson, who, your colleague has written about, quite favorably and justifiably so, John Diefenbaker and Lester Pearson were great enemies. And Diefenbaker wouldn't hesitate to call him so. So he did have battles. He had battles with the press. And, he had enemies within his own party. So Diefenbaker had a many-front war going on. But you look at what he actually did, the substance of his work, what he did for the Canadian economy, for Canadian sovereignty, dealing with the discrimination as existed was widespread in Canada, how he developed roads to resources, expelled South Africa from the Commonwealth, stood up to the American president who was trying to dominate Canada. You look at almost every issue that was fundamental to the times that Diefenbaker was prime minister, he was always on the right side of history. So what do they say about Diefenbaker substantively of a critical nature? Maybe it's the Avro era, which I think he was on the right side of history. Maybe it was sacking the governor of the Bank of Canada, James Coyne. I think when you look at the record, those were the correct decisions, controversial as they may be, and time has proven him to be correct. And so why he's a great prime minister? Because of the foundations that he laid down, standing up for what was right and just, advancing the infrastructure that built the prosperity for our future, passing the Bill of Rights, the first woman in cabinet, the first Indigenous senator, the first Francophone Governor General of Canada. The list is long.
Was it because he wasn't as polished? Was it because he maybe could be seen as being a kind of a consummate outsider? John Diefenbaker identified himself with ordinary people.
He would take that as an ultimate compliment. He said, I can't help but stick up for ordinary people. I'm one of them. Born in poverty, grew up in a small town. The guy who didn't have an elite education did not belong to any of the clubs that the people around him in Parliament or in cabinet had grown up all their lives. People in Canada knew who he stood for and with, and it was ordinary Canadians.
Who were his political heroes?
Certainly Sir John A. Macdonald, Winston Churchill, Abraham Lincoln, another small-town lawyer who fought to end the Confederacy that was emerging and slavery in the United States. So strong, visionary leaders who had purpose, vision, and destiny.
And he liked a liberal. He liked Laurier, too.
He liked Laurier an awful lot. He did like the attachment to the British monarchy and the traditions of Parliament. Laurier was pro-immigrant. Laurier was also fond of the British monarchy, interestingly enough. But what he did not like about Laurier was Laurier's friendliness with the United States, more so than who he thought what the prime minister should be. So when Laurier was advocating for free trade in the 1911 election, that's something Diefenbaker could not support.
And what did he like so much about Sir John A. Macdonald?
Macdonald did the impossible. When American manifest destiny was as strong and as powerful as it ever could be, when Canada didn't exist, there was a loose collection of British colonies. And in the central Canada, Canada East, Canada West, it was a failed experiment trying to bring Upper Canada and Lower Canada together. Macdonald reconciled not only the dysfunction that existed in the pre-Confederation Parliament in the Canadian Union, but also bringing PEI eventually, not initially, but New Brunswick and Nova Scotia together, and then stretched the country from one coast to the other to ensure Canadian independence. And without Macdonald, we would not have Canada. Without Macdonald, we would be swept up into the United States and we would have lost the parliamentary democracy that he was so fond of. And Diefenbaker was an inheritor of that and advocated for policies to ensure that Canadian independence was retained.
We talked about the fact that he greatly admired the likes of Abraham Lincoln, and in Canada, he loved John A. Macdonald. He also admired Wilfrid Laurier. Why and how did he become a conservative? And why would he say he was a conservative?
So his family was liberal. He grew up as someone who would be inclined to be liberal. In Saskatchewan, the Liberal Party was dominant provincially, and they were sending federal MPs. So maybe there's this inclination of him to be the underdog, to sign up with a party that's not popular. But more so than that was Macdonald, certainly an influence, the British parliamentary democracy that was more at home in the Progressive Conservative Party. The Liberals were, if you look at Lester Pearson, far more friendly with the Americans than were the Conservatives at the time. And so it was the sense that the Progressive Conservative Party stood first and foremost for an independent Canada, which is why he joined up. But he was not, Adrian, he was not ideological in any way, other than on some core principles and values, ending discrimination, freedom for the individual, helping the poor. Not from an ideological perspective. He just wanted to help people.
That's interesting because one often wants to kind of understand the kind of conservative or the kind of liberal a politician is. So with regard to John Diefenbaker, what kind of conservative was he? Because it seems as if he had elements of libertarianism. There was a kind of a Western populist aspect to him. What kind of conservative was he?
So he was a libertarian in the sense that he resisted government overreach or the heavy hand of government, whether it was the Winnipeg strike or when he was prime minister and the premier of Newfoundland wanted him to bring in the RCMP to break up a strike that had gone violent. He was very hesitant about using the heavy hand of government. So from that perspective, it wasn't a far-right conservative that you get in some authoritarian regimes. It was more a classical conservative that was more smaller government or a less strenuous government. He was more of a folk hero than he was a traditional conservative. If you looked at the party at the time, their power base was in Bay Street. It was bankers. It was business people. That was not him. He remade the party with his election as leader. And in fact, when he became leader, and if you looked at the campaign and the campaign posters and slogans and advertising, it was "Follow John." Almost nowhere would you see progressive conservative. He didn't even like to see himself referred to as a Tory. And you might think that's a bit counterintuitive. It's a bit counterweight. But think by the time he ran in the 1957 election as leader, this is after he had lost 5 elections in a row and lost 2 leadership contests, the Conservative Party, Progressive Conservative Party, had won a single victory in the last 9 election contests. Under Diefenbaker, they won 3 in a row. When I say he didn't come forward to office with a fixed set of ideology other than, an independent Canada was near the top of the list, he launched more royal commissions than any other prime minister because he was a problem solver and he wanted the benefit of the best minds and the best ideas, and he wanted to test them out, and he wanted to ensure that they were practical and worked and were seen so by the Canadian people. He ran very much as an independent more than a member of a political party. But of course, he needed that vehicle to gain power.
His journey to becoming an MP took a long time. You noted something that was quite extraordinary about John Diefenbaker. He lost 5 elections before he won one. That's incredible that he had that kind of resilience to keep on going.
Yeah, who does that? Who says, okay, I'm going to try number 6? And I'll tell you who does it. It's the person who has a purpose, a vision, and a destiny that's greater than himself. So it's what I talk about, his desire to help people, to end discrimination, to protect an independent Canada. These were more important than John Diefenbaker himself. He certainly had a big ego, and people followed him. He was given much praise even in defeat, and he had the fortitude to stick with it, and ultimately it did pay off.
John Diefenbaker finally makes it to Parliament in 1940. What kind of Parliament was he entering?
So this is during the Second World War, a strong liberal government. And he saw his purpose coming into 1940 to support the government in its war efforts, not to be critical to the point that would cause division within Canada, but to hold the government to account. So he did object to the fact that it really wasn't a government that was accountable to Parliament, that it was really run by a very small number of people through orders in council. So he did his best to point out areas of discrimination. I would say that he was not an ultra partisan at that time. And even when Mackenzie King was gone and Louis Saint Laurent came in, where he would take exception to the government was when they were disrespecting Parliament and they were putting through projects without proper authority from Parliament and they were abusing their power. So he was certainly a competitor and a partisan, but he was also a great contributor to debate in the House of Commons.
Was it clear at that time that he was an up-and-comer? Was it clear that eventually, that it was inevitable, that he would become leader of the party?
I'd say quite the opposite. So he did run twice for leader when it came up and got embarrassed effectively, certainly the first time. And those who made decisions and who orchestrated conventions did everything they could to stop Diefenbaker from becoming leader.
Why didn't they want him?
Because he wasn't one of them. He had an independent mind. He would not support the business establishment, the corporate establishment. They didn't think they could trust him, that he was talking about helping poor people, and they didn't think at the time, the people in the party didn't think that was the role of government.
So they couldn't control him.
They couldn't control him. And in fact, when he finally won in 1956, they launched a Stop Diefenbaker campaign and then eventually gave up. And they said, there's no use, we got to stop kicking against the pricks. The ordinary people want him. And so we have to give way and let him have one shot. He'll lose the election and we'll get back to business as usual. But lo and behold, he won that election that they all thought he would lose.
John Diefenbaker takes over a Conservative Party that knows a lot about losing. They'd lost consistently over a couple of decades. Talk a little bit about the political landscape in Canada at that time in the mid-1950s.
Well, it was an era of great prosperity. Post-Second World War, we were building the St. Lawrence Seaway. Great progress was being made. There were some issues around ownership of Canadian industry that, we had a lot of foreign direct investment. But the economy was reasonably well managed. We had powerful ministers, C.D. Howe, who were improving the competitiveness of our economy. So I would say, there was relative peace and tranquility somewhat. It wasn't a society that was free of discrimination. That certainly existed profoundly. They were probably making more progress than they were making south of the border, but it wasn't a just society, from that perspective. But what ultimately brought the Saint Laurent government down and Diefenbaker to power were two things. One, the arrogance of the Liberal government. And then there was, John Diefenbaker, this outsider who caught people's attention and interest. So those two factors led to his stunning win in 1957.
So Diefenbaker wins the election in 57, defeating an overconfident Liberal Party led by Louis Saint Laurent. What was his platform in that 57 election? What did he tell Canadians he wanted to do?
So he talked about supporting the elderly. He talked about supporting the farmers. He talked about Canadian independence, gaining control of our economy, developing our resources. So there was a visionary aspect to it, but I'd say more than anything else, it is John Diefenbaker demonstrating who he would represent as prime minister. And that meant ordinary Canadians. When they felt that the previous Liberal government had lost touch with ordinary citizens, that they were working on these nation-building projects, but they weren't necessarily on their side, and they were a little bit too closely aligned with big business. And, Diefenbaker was definitely not that. And change is, an incredibly powerful force in politics. And it was time for change. The Liberals governments had been there since 1935, and here we're 1957. So he rode that. But, even weeks before the election, the polls still had him down. Maclean's magazine went to press and had a printed version of their magazine out that said that Saint Laurent had been reelected and Diefenbaker defeated, just to show you how he defied expectations in that election.
What kind of prime minister was he? What stands out for you as a historian? How did he conduct himself in that first mandate?
Well, the first mandate didn't last very long. It was less than a year. In that time, he conducted a grand international tour. He was talking about the things that he wanted to implement, which was the Bill of Rights, to deal with the scourge of discrimination in Canada. We had just began a recession. And so Diefenbaker said, if I have a choice between running a deficit or supporting the unemployed, I'm going to support the unemployed. So in that short period, what happened was Lester Pearson became leader of the Liberal Party. I mean, you think about Diefenbaker having very weak credentials, where Lester Pearson had just won the Nobel Peace Prize and, highly credentialed and, a man of the world. He became leader of the Liberal Party. And on day one, he said that Diefenbaker should resign and Pearson should be named prime minister to gain the confidence of the House without need of an election. And Diefenbaker thought that was incredibly arrogant. And rather than follow Pearson's advice, he went to the Governor General and said, let's have another election. So he had an election in 58 where he won the largest majority in Canadian history to this day on a proportionate basis.
You mentioned a little bit earlier his desire to have a Bill of Rights for Canada. Why was he so enamored with the idea of a Bill of Rights?
He was enamored with it at a time when no one else was. He was not responding to a call of Canadians for a Bill of Rights, but it was a product of his experience. Growing up in the prairies in a small town with a Germanic ancestry, experiencing and witnessing the abuses that took place during the Second World War, seeing how poorly treated Indigenous Canadians were, his courtroom experience of fighting for the underdog and those who were charged with crimes that they shouldn't have been because they were scapegoated. We did not have an act or a statement about standing up for values and principles that opposed discrimination. Diefenbaker wanted the Bill of Rights to act as a cornerstone on which all subsequent legislation and existing legislation could be judged as to whether it met that test of the Bill of Rights that he had passed in 1960. And in fact, it was used to strike down laws that were discriminatory in nature.
You make the case that John Diefenbaker, and you say it quite often in your book, that he was a friend of Indigenous peoples, that he was an advocate, that he fought for Indigenous peoples. And you said that he was a friend of Indigenous peoples like Sir John A. Macdonald, which surprised me when you said that, because I haven't seen Macdonald as being a friend of Indigenous peoples. This was someone who was a key architect of the Indian residential school system, who talked about wanting to do away with the tribal system and assimilate Indian people in all respects. this is someone who, under whose tenure, Indigenous peoples become wards of the Canadian state. This is someone who banned Indigenous cultural ceremonies like the potluck and the Sundance in 1884, legalizes the administrative control of Indians under the British North America Act. So I wasn't sure when you said that he was a friend of Indigenous peoples like Sir John A. Macdonald. I found that curious.
So in the era of Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada was a racist country. The prevailing view of the settlers who came into North America was not one to treat Indigenous people with respect. Macdonald, unlike any other world leader of his era, of his time, and certainly unlike any other politician in Canada or the parties opposite, showed respect and admiration for Indigenous people and saved more Indigenous lives than any Canadian Prime Minister in history.
But Bob, he sought their erasure and elimination. He wanted to get rid of autonomous Indigenous nations. How is that being a friend of Indigenous peoples?
So I think you're wrong on the facts and wrong on history on that. He did not want to do what the Americans did. The Americans declared war on Indigenous people. They slaughtered them. They killed them willfully. They tried to completely eradicate the Indigenous population. And in fact, the American Indigenous population, one of their responses was to come to Canada, where they were treated far more respectfully.
But I didn't say that Macdonald wanted to eliminate Indigenous peoples. What I said was he wanted to erase autonomous Indigenous nations, which is important. There's a distinction there.
So, he was the one, he didn't even want to accept Western Canada as land, and he didn't want to settle that land until treaties were signed with Indigenous peoples. So he signed the treaties that provided for certain, health care and certain rations. Now, not all of his policies were executed faithfully, honestly, or competently. But if you look for example, when smallpox was devastating population in Canada, the portion of the population that was most protected from smallpox during Macdonald's era were Indigenous people because they got the vaccine when others did not. He gave the Indigenous people the vote against the wishes of the other parties opposite. He didn't go to war with them, and he was sympathetic towards them in all respect. The challenge that he had was he was settling Canada to keep it independent from the United States. That created the need for a national railway and some settlement and some immigration. And so there was a lot of conflict for certain.
But he saw white folks as being superior. When he approved the execution of Louis Riel for high treason and hanged, what was it? I think 8 other First Nations leaders. In 1885, he says, quote, "The executions ought to convince the red man that the white man governs."
When it comes to Louis Riel, who had launched 2 insurrections against the Canadian government that resulted in the murders of Scott and others, Macdonald wanted Riel to be a strong and noble citizen of Canada. Riel fled to the United States. Riel came back to Canada, launched another revolution. Macdonald sent out emissaries to negotiate terms of peace and accommodation with Louis Riel. That was not faithfully executed by his embassies, and violence occurred. It was the legal system, the jury system, that convicted Louis Riel of high treason, for which the crime was death. What Macdonald did at that point was to send out 3 doctors to assess Riel's condition, I think hoping that they would come back and say that Louis Riel was not of sound mind and body, effectively giving him the authority to override what the jury had convicted Riel of, and they came back and said that he was of sound mind and body. I think it was a mistake for Macdonald, for the country, for Riel to have been hanged in that circumstance. It certainly created great divisions in Canada. It was a mistake on his part, but it was not done out of malice. When it comes to the residential schools far, far predated Sir John A. Macdonald and were dramatically expanded after Macdonald. They were never mandatory during Macdonald's terms. And in fact, when there were efforts made to either close residential schools or not to fund them, the complaints at that time came from the Indigenous people themselves. There was an assimilation component to it for certain, but it was done more not to conquer, but in his heart and mind, it was to help, to give them the education, to ensure that they could sustain their lives It was a terrible thing that happened, but it wasn't done out of malice on Macdonald's part.
I guess we'll have to continue this debate because it's really supposed to be about Diefenbaker, but I'm not sure if it was altruism on Macdonald's part. Like, Macdonald often saw Indigenous peoples as being impediments to the expansion of Canada.
So I think you're mischaracterizing the history with Macdonald. If you go back 15 years ago, the entire country was celebrating Macdonald. Same with Diefenbaker. Indigenous people were celebrating them for what they contributed. And there was one book that came out, Clearing the Plains, that highlighted a quote from Macdonald about not feeding Indigenous people until they were essentially on starvation, which was to encourage them to go to the reserves where the foods were and not to feed them when they were off reserve. And so that took on completely a whole new chapter. But I encourage you to read Patrice Dutil's book on Macdonald and others that have written since then, because it's a very selective interpretation of history that characterizes Macdonald as a villain.
No, I'm not trying to characterize Macdonald as a villain. I actually feel, and you can disagree, that I'm being true to history, that Macdonald absolutely was a nation builder. Without Macdonald, there's no Canada. He was an extraordinary political figure. I've read Richard Gwynn's biography. I read it years ago. He was an impressive political force in this country. So he was a nation builder, but you can also make the argument that he was a nation destroyer in that he destroyed Indigenous nations.
So in that book by Richard Gwynn, a fair assessment is that Macdonald was a progressive, sympathetic leader to Indigenous people when society was profoundly racist. And he was countering the instincts in society to be as respectful as any, more so than any leader in the world when it comes to dealing with Indigenous populations. So I think you've been quite harsh on Macdonald.
Okay. Well, let's go back to Diefenbaker, because in 1960, he does something which was, at the time, quite monumental in granting the vote to Indigenous peoples for the first time in history.
So no, it's not the first time in history, because Macdonald had done it. And then the Liberals took it away. And the policy of the Liberal government for 60 years before Diefenbaker became Prime Minister was that Indigenous people could get the vote if they completely surrendered their status. So if they renounced any form of connection to their heritage, they could get the vote. Diefenbaker thought that was wrong. He thought that Canada should respect the treaties that Macdonald had signed with Indigenous people on behalf of the Crown. And so without seeking anything in return, he said all Indigenous people have the right to vote and their treaty rights are completely respected. Now, at the time, Indigenous people were actually suspicious. They were nervous that if they actually voted, that somehow they would lose their rights. And it took quite a long time before they understood what Diefenbaker's intent and the power of his message. And he not only did that, he appointed the first Indigenous person to the Senate of Canada, because there was no prospect of an Indigenous person getting elected as an MP at the time, and he wanted them represented in Parliament. And he effectively took the voice of Indigenous people to Parliament. And he did so from 1940 until he died in 1979.
Diefenbaker has been criticized for scuttling a Canadian-made technological marvel, and that was the Avro Arrow, and basically driving a generation of scientists and engineers who'd been associated with the project to build the fighter aircraft to move to greener pastures in the United States. Was the Avro Arrow a mistake in canceling it, in ending that project? Was that one of his biggest political mistakes?
So there were certainly political consequences to it, and the loss of Canadian talent, those who worked on the aircraft, is lamentable. The decision itself to cancel the Avro Arrow was the right decision.
Why?
For a number of reasons. First of all, it was the decision that had been made by the Louis Saint Laurent government. It was the decision of the Canadian military. It was the decision of the Canadian bureaucracy that they had made prior to the 57 election. They just didn't want to announce it because they thought it would be, negatively viewed in the country and potentially could cost them a couple of seats. Diefenbaker had the courage to do what was the right thing to do. The why is, here we're, if not at the peak, we're coming close to the peak of the Cold War. The threat is Russia. And the threat at the time was not that they were going to fly across Russia through Canada with bombers and take out American sites and bomb them. The threat was intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Avro Arrow at the time, or any fighter aircraft, was going to be completely ineffective when it came to dealing with the threat of the time. It was missiles, the Beaumark missile and others, where the military wanted to make their investment to stand up to the military threat at the time. The Avro Arrow was a white elephant. It had increased in price to produce a plane to an astronomical level, a ridiculous level. There was only a few prototypes that were ever developed. What was impressive about it was the speed that the plane could fly at, although it never carried any weapons. And the only way that it could have been remotely feasible for the Canadian government to pursue this is if there had been a worldwide demand for this aircraft. If we had developed something that no one else had ever seen before, and they came knocking at our door, well, we couldn't sell one damn plane. There was no interest in it whatsoever. And in fact, the whole program had been infiltrated by a spy at that point, although that's not why they canceled it. It was a glorious project and a feat of engineering that was completely and totally ineffective and useless. The fault was when they canceled it, how could they have retained that talent in Canada? Much of it went to NASA and to Boeing. And to that, Diefenbaker offered generous transition plans to try to keep that talent here, but the company effectively closed up shop overnight as soon as that aircraft was canceled, and they would not cooperate with the federal government on the transition plan. So it was the right decision, although that didn't stop the CBC, the place you used to work at, from producing, I think, their highest rated documentary of all time on the Avro Arrow that fictionalized the story that created folk heroes, even brought up Dan Aykroyd to play the CEO of the airline company.
Well, he is from Ottawa. He is from here.
Dan Aykroyd. So, great actor, and it got great ratings, but it was a work of slander. This wasn't nation building by the CBC. This was kind of pandering to the anti-Diefenbaker sentiments and creating a work of fiction, but they did the country no favor when they produced that series.
Did John Diefenbaker fundamentally mishandle what many people would describe as the most important relationship of Canada, and that's with the United States? Did he, for reasons of, ego, for reasons of anti-Americanism, misunderstand perhaps his role as a Canadian Prime Minister in dealing with the United States?
Well, I think he saw his role differently than those who came before him, and maybe even those who came immediately after him. He saw his role as Prime Minister as to stick up first and foremost for a sovereign Canada. And that meant that decisions would be made what was in the best interests of Canada, and he would not take directions from the United States. Now, he had a very sour relationship with John F. Kennedy, who called him a bastard and a son of a bitch. And, there was just no chemistry. There was better chemistry between Dwight Eisenhower and Diefenbaker. But Kennedy thought that Canada and Diefenbaker should do whatever he asked. Kennedy didn't want us to sell wheat to China, didn't want us to trade with Cuba. He wanted us to accept American-controlled nuclear weapons on our soil. Kennedy wanted Canada to join the Organization of American States. Diefenbaker said, no, it's not in our national interest, and no. And so Kennedy made it his mission to have Diefenbaker defeated. And what is the most overt and covert foreign election interference in Canadian history is John F. Kennedy seeking to have Diefenbaker defeated by sending his generals up here, sending his political strategists up here, giving advice to Lester Pearson, to the point that Lester Pearson had to say, stop, you've gone too far. So I think Diefenbaker understood, to your question, his role quite well, and it was not to be a satellite or subservient to an American president.
Was he anti-American?
He was pro-Canadian. Let's look at Jean Chretien. Was Jean Chretien anti-American? He had three goals, and one of them was to keep our distance from the United States. He thought we had become too cozy. And ultimately, it was that sentiment of maintaining Canadian independence that kept us out of the war in Iraq. Was Chretien anti-American? I don't think so. I think he was pro-Canadian. He wanted to do what was right for Canada, and I think Diefenbaker was in the same category.
What do you regard as being his greatest accomplishments in office?
His greatest accomplishments was how he showed the government could support the Canadian people, particularly those who were vulnerable, poor. He launched government-funded hospital care. It didn't exist until John Diefenbaker. He didn't think people should go bankrupt because of an illness. He helped the poor, he helped the farmers. He not only developed our resources, but he stood up to any force of discrimination in Canada against Indigenous people, against minorities, the Bill of Rights. And he turned a political party from a party of losers into a party of winners. And he led a scandal-free government. He knew whose side he was on. So in some respects, he restored the faith of the Canadian people in Canada, in its democracy, in its political institutions, that they could be a force for good. And then he could stand up for an independent Canada, even against challenges from countries far more powerful, be it the United Kingdom or the United States or elsewhere. And he could stand up to communism as he did against Nikita Khrushchev, quite famously at the United Nations, and identified with the people that the Soviet Union was suppressing. So he was a good man with a good heart, with a strong vision, who did a lot of good, and who probably hung on a little bit too long.
The modern Conservative Party has now lost 4 consecutive elections. John Diefenbaker won 3 elections in a row. What can this version of the Conservative Party learn from John Diefenbaker's example?
I'd say study the man and his connection to ordinary Canadians, and the story that you tell. This isn't just about the current Conservative Party, but it's almost lessons for anyone in public life. In some respects, you could see elements of John Diefenbaker in this last election campaign on all parties, talking about who they represent. Every party was talking about an independent Canada. Every party was talking about helping ordinary Canadians. So those lessons endure across political lines. I think he's got lessons for all politicians.
Bob Plamondon, thanks so much for joining us.
Adrian, it's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant on Ricochet Media. Producer and sound engineer, Dave Sarrazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music by Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Killoran. I'm Adrian Harewood. I'll talk to you next time.